Thank you very much, everybody. We're going to shift gears a bit now and focus on the progress that we have or perhaps have not been making in terms of the net zero carbon transition. I'm joined by a wonderful panel here this morning who are going to help us unpick what's been going on. So we have immediately on my left, Ingrid Holmes, who's the Executive Director at the Green Finance Institute, previously at Federated Hermes and the consulting firm E3G. We then have my wonderful colleague Claire Jervis, who's an Associate Fund Manager at WHEB, previously at Barings, and then finally Luke Sussams, who's the Head of ESG and Sustainable Finance Strategy for the EMEA region for Jefferies, and previously at Kepler Chevreux and Carbon Tracker. And actually, Ingrid, Luke, and I all have something in common. And I'm just wondering, looking at our LinkedIn profiles, if either of you can guess what it is.
Went to Imperial?
That's right, yes. We all did the Environmental Technology Masters at Imperial College, although I have to say I was first. Out of the three of us, I am the eldest. But before we start the panel discussion, I just wanted to provide a bit of context, really, to the conversation. And I've got a few rather complicated charts to show you, but I hope this one is worth sharing. So essentially what this is showing is a series of scenarios or forecasts really in terms of what global greenhouse gas emissions were expected to look like at particular dates. So you can see on the chart in 2020 the profile of what analysts thought global greenhouse gas emissions would look like, and then each of the subsequent forecasts comes up to date on 2024. And there are two sort of core messages here. The first is that the forecasts that were made in 2020 for emissions this year significantly underestimated what emissions are going to look like. So emissions essentially have bounced back more quickly than people had anticipated. They thought in 2020 that we'd be emitting around just under 51 gigatons of carbon in 2024. In actual fact, it was more like 53. Or the expectation this year is that it's going to be more like 53 gigatons. So kind of worse, recent historical experience has been worse than people had expected. But when you look forward to 2050, you can see how the anticipated emissions are expected to come down, or have been coming down. So in 2020, we thought that we would be emitting about 54 gigatons in 2050, and the most recent forecast suggests that's going to be more like 49 gigatons, and that's mainly because of accelerated deployment of renewable energies. So kind of negative in the recent history, but more optimistic going forward. So that's sort of kind of good news. The bad news is that it's kind of nowhere near enough. So this chart, which also comes from Climate Action Tracker, shows you the anticipated emissions in 2030, so that policies and actions segment at the top relates to warming of between 2.2 and 3.4 degrees. The pledges and targets, which is what we would get if all existing pledges and targets were implemented, that gets us to between 1.7 and 2.7 degrees. And you can see how much lower the 1.5 degree trajectory is. And so there's an enormous gap to close. Another way of just putting this is around, this comes from a UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme report, in terms of the likelihood of achieving or the likelihood of exceeding specific temperature objectives. So you can see with current policies, we have zero chance of meeting a 1.5 degree target. In fact, we have very little chance of meeting a 2 degree target either. And then you get more optimistic as you go through those scenarios, but even the most optimistic one, we have very little chance of achieving 1.5 degrees. And as I'm sure many of you know, this year we will almost certainly exceed that target, albeit probably temporarily, but a little bit more optimistic about 2 degrees. So that's the kind of the context. We're going to now quickly go through each of the big segments. So this is the global greenhouse gas emissions and the contribution from different parts of the economy. And we're just going to walk around each of those segments and just try and unpick exactly what's going on. So if I could turn to you, Luke, to start with. So we've seen the power sector is still the largest contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. You've spent a lot of time kind of looking at it and analysing what's been going on. Perhaps you could just explain why power generation is still responsible for most greenhouse gas emissions and how this is expected to change.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Seb, and pleasure to be here. So I guess at the risk of stating the obvious, it's all about coal, really. At the global level, of course, there is just a hell of a lot of coal still on the power grid. So last year, in fact, coal was the single largest power source in terms of power generation. It accounted for 35%. So really the theory of change for decarbonizing the power sector more quickly is to accelerate the displacement of existing coal assets, right? Which is the whole sort of stranded assets theory of change, of course. The upside, and you wanted me to try and be positive, of course, is around new installations. When it comes to new installations of power gen, really the race is run. Renewables has won that race. So again, last year, 85% of new power capacity installations were from renewables. It was mainly solar, it was mainly in China. When you hear Fatih Birol, the executive director of the IEA, talk about it, he says there's going to be a solar revolution and that it's going to be unstoppable, and really I listen to everything that he says, to be honest. So the tricky part, however, that's the sort of really positive side to the story. The tricky part, of course, comes when you compare those sort of stats and figures with then what's happened in the equity markets. And it's just so interesting to look at. So maybe if I can give you just a few numbers for the period of beginning of 2021 to the end of 2023, right? So for this period, there was a global increase in solar power capacity of 63% in absolute terms. Invesco's solar ETF, which is the largest solar ETF on the planet, decreased by 48% over that same period. For wind, installations increased by 23%. Again, the largest wind index fell by 19%. And the trends are really the same for EVs and for batteries too. And what we're saying to our clients, WHEB of course is one, is that we really need to unpick exactly what happened in that period and why there was that divergence if we have any chance of really for the transition to continuing at a strong sort of pace. And for us, that means that we've got to ask three really quite uncomfortable sort of questions, actually. And these are the three chapters of the transition that we think investors and policymakers and other stakeholder groups really need to focus on. The first of those is, at what pace will renewables gain market share? And last year you had Kingsmill Bond come and present and talk about S-curves, and we're definitely big buyers of S-curve theory, that this will be the rate or the shape at which renewables will gain market share. The thing, however, we need to ask is, what is the shape of that curve? Is it steep? Is it shallow? Because ultimately that will determine the pace. That's sort of chapter one that Kingsmill talks so well about. Chapter two, of course, is will we be able to deliver that profitably for investors? Because we are, of course, convinced that without the investment community, really the pace of the transition will be too slow. How can we safeguard that profitability? Well, actually, the UK is a really good example to look at on that. If you look at the latest CFD AR6 auction that occurred here in the UK, you will see that the UK government guaranteed project developers a strike price of £90 per megawatt hour, which is pretty healthy and pretty much guarantees the profitability of almost that entire value chain. So the UK government did exactly what people wanted, and they stepped up to the mark. The tricky part then, for us at least, and what we're now really starting to think through is chapter 3, which is, then does renewables have that deflationary impact on power prices that benefits consumers? Because you really need consumers also to be on board, otherwise, again, this won't happen. And so we find those three chapters really helpful to think about, and maybe for other investors in the room, and we would recommend to sort of go to that and unpick those a little bit.
Great, thank you very much. Claire, maybe you could just talk a little bit about how WHEB has navigated that difficult environment.
Yeah, so as Luke was kind of alluding to there, there has been a huge divergence between the actual fundamental success of adoption rates in renewable energy and actual performance of listed equity stocks that are making those technologies. And we really think that one of the biggest issues, not just for us as investors, but also for global decarbonisation more broadly, is just China and China's irresponsible behaviour. China has privileged access to a lot of the raw materials that are used to manufacture renewable energy technologies. And what they have been doing is they've been investing heavily in that capacity over the last decade. And we need that capacity. We need that manufacturing capacity, globally. But they've been doing it in a way that is uneconomical. They have been throwing subsidies at it. A lot of their factories are running very thin profit margins, some of them even unprofitable. And so this is really driving down prices of solar panels. And you would think that that would facilitate greater adoption. But what happens is, because it's such a political issue, Western countries, particularly the US, responds to this economically irresponsible behaviour by putting in place policies like we had Section 201, which puts tariffs on imports of cheap Chinese solar panels. We have the Inflation Reduction Act, of course, which is an effort to domesticate manufacturing of a number of renewable technologies in response to China's behaviour. And really, it just makes it a very turbulent and volatile equity market to invest in, because you have uncertainty around these policies, you have changes in power in government, as we've seen obviously this year with the US. We think the Inflation Reduction Act should be relatively safe from a Trump presidency, but obviously, with control of the president's office, the House and the Senate, it is a risk. And so it's just a very turbulent market. The way that we have approached this, we have had some success stories. Probably our best has been First Solar, which is a US manufacturer of solar panels, which has really benefited from a lot of those policies and tariffs. But other sectors have been more challenging. Residential solar has been one of them, with it being quite a consumer discretionary purchase, actually, to put solar panels on your house. As you can imagine, as interest rates climbed, as inflation climbed, a lot of consumers were kind of reluctant to make that investment. Wind also is something that should be a really positive story, but in actual fact has been really hampered by uncertainty around policy, and also things like NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Everyone wants wind power, but no one wants a wind turbine spoiling their view. So so really we've chosen now to focus predominantly on utility scale solar. We do still have First Solar in our portfolio. We've recently added this year Nextracker, which is a global manufacturer of solar trackers for utility scale solar. We think that this is one of the lowest cost energy forms you can deploy. It is very well supported economically as well as by policy, so you're not too reliant on policy to drive adoption rates. And really, we think that this is where probably the bulk of new renewable energy capacity is going to get built. And so we're just thinking very carefully about which companies in that supply chain would make good investments.
Great. Okay, thank you. Maybe we can now turn to transport, which is actually the third largest source of emissions. And talking about consumer interest in residential solar, obviously this is a topic of conversation that we're all familiar with in terms of electric vehicles and appetites for electric vehicles. And maybe just very quickly, we could do a quick Slido question. Who in the audience, I think the question will come up in a second, but in the audience, do you own an electric vehicle or a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle? Simple question. If you could say yes or no. Interesting to see. I should have had one about if you're thinking of buying an electric vehicle as well. But that's still pretty good. I mean, I'm not sure what the penetration rate is currently of electric vehicles in the UK car pool. I should think it's probably still, mid-single digits or something. Higher for if you're buying a new car. New cars is probably more like 20%. But maybe Ingrid, we could come to you and just get your thoughts on transport and how are we doing in terms of reducing emissions in transport.
Yeah, so I think the story around cars is actually quite a positive one, and obviously the more quickly we wean ourselves off oil, the less power the fossil fuel lobby has in climate negotiations. So it's an important area to consider. So I think in terms of progress, we're broadly on track. I think this is a good news story in terms of technology development and adoption. I checked in with our team, and in 2023, around a fifth of all new cars sold globally were electric, and that tracks progress in the UK. So we now see 40 million electric vehicles on the road globally and 1.3 on the road in the UK, and that's a five-fold increase in the UK since 2020. So things are accelerating, all very positive. I think the criticisms we hear in the news sort of confuse the storyline around this somewhat. It's all kind of hard to know whether we're making progress or not. But in actual fact, if you look at the total cost of ownership of an electric vehicle compared to an internal combustion engine vehicle, it is lower, with average savings of around £750 a year, not to be sniffed at. I think the other one we hear is that of drivers that have moved over to electric vehicles, 9 out of 10 wouldn't want to go back. So they're just sort of superior forms of transportation. The other one we hear a lot on is range anxiety, but some of the new models can reach over 230 kilometres, so 2 weeks driving for the average user. And rapid chargers can charge in up to 80% of your battery in 20 to 40 minutes. So that usability is increasing all the time. One of the things we're focused most on actually at the Green Finance Institute is getting more private finance into charging infrastructure. Our sense is that's the big one to address. So making sure that we don't just have good access in cities and on main thoroughfares, but everywhere. And given that we now have an expectation of the electric vehicle phase-out date of being brought forward to 2030, it's pretty clear where the direction of travel is, and so this feels like a pretty solid investment. The only thing I would sort of add is, obviously there's been a lot of quite sad news about factory closures in Luton. This is about consolidation of production in other sites. It's something that we have known is going to be coming for years, and something, you know, going back 6 years when I was at Federated Hermes, we were already talking to the original equipment manufacturers around the need to manage this in a fair way, thinking about natural, retirements or retraining or whatever it is. So, and it's a function actually across a lot of the green transition. As the technology gets electrified, the number of parts you have is fewer, so the jobs are fewer too. So it's something we do need to think about.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. I'm going to, just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next segment. I suspect we won't get through all of the segments because there are lots of questions as well that we're getting from the audience. But Claire, maybe if we could turn to industry now, which is, I think, often forgotten really as a source of emissions. But maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what's going on there.
Yeah, so obviously the main source of emissions in industry is power. And we've kind of talked about, renewable energy transition. So the other kind of big topic that we're focused on with regards to industry is actually decarbonisation of industrial heat, because this actually makes up about 25% of global energy demand. And heat is used in a broad range of industrial processes. And so, a lot of industrial heat is still reliant quite heavily, as kind of Luke alluded to, with coal and gas. And so really we're focused on, firstly, how we can get industrial businesses to use less heat and to use it more optimally. So we do invest in companies that seek to kind of reduce the amount of heat or heat loss in their manufacturing plants. But also, we're really interested in how you can directly electrify industrial heat itself. And so instead of relying on things that might be powered by coal to generate heat, actually directly electrify it, and so that you can use renewable energy exclusively. And so one of the companies we have in our portfolio that's supporting both of those goals is Spirax-Sarco. They originally set out their business as specialists in steam. So steam is a really efficient form of heat transfer. And what Spirax does fundamentally is they send people into factories to perform steam audits, and they can check, if you can imagine all of these different pipes in a factory all carrying hot steam, they can check where in those pipes steam is being lost, and then they can sell a full service suite of products and components that can help to really close those leaks. So that's really interesting. And they're also now investing in electric thermal solutions, so ways in which you can directly electrify industrial processes, ideally potentially using exclusively renewable energy. And I think one thing that is really important to kind of come back to the coal point and also the China point is that, you know, one thing that should be quite straightforward actually is replacing blast furnaces with electric arc furnaces in the manufacture of steel, because steel is a huge global emitter. And China is the biggest manufacturer of steel globally, and they're still relying predominantly on blast furnaces, which does use coal. So if we can transition to electric arc furnaces, you can use renewable power or perhaps hydrogen in that process as well to really decarbonise the production of steel, and that could be a really big contributor to decarbonisation.
Great. I'm going to come to questions in a second, but I did also just want to touch on agriculture, Ingrid, given Guy's comments that preceded ours. Agriculture is the second largest, agriculture and forestry is the second largest source of emissions. We've heard about how power is, the technologies exist to reduce emissions from power, and we're beginning to see that happen in certain parts of the world. So agriculture is at risk of becoming the largest source of emissions. Is it fair to see them as a bit of to see that industry as a bit of a laggard, or are other things to be more positive about that?
I mean, you can look at it in two ways. It's not the original source of the problem, is it? And we need agriculture to be successful because we need to eat and we need those products. So, but it is true that it is what we call a hard-to-abate sector. It's a diffuse set of issues with a diffuse set of solutions, and there are broadly two themes, I think. One is the links between agriculture and deforestation, which needs to stop and be reversed, and that's principally around, what we all hear about going on in the Amazon, clearing of land to raise cattle, soy to feed cattle to feed this voracious demand for meat. But then there's a subsection of that that's actually about poverty, about subsistence farming. So as far back as the 90s, when I was in Tanzania as a conservation forest biologist, I saw people living in the forest, clearing land to raise maize crops actually at the time. And then the rains come and all that topsoil's washed into the river and you start again. So actually, as Guy was saying, helping people with tools and with techniques to farm more sustainably on existing land is going to be absolutely key. But then the second piece is the stewardship of the land that is already under agricultural use, which is something like 40% of the ice-free surface of Earth. We need to remediate what we're doing now, and I think the drivers of that not happening are the razor-thin margins that we see farmers on at the moment. Guy talked about the toxic relationship with supermarkets, people not wanting to pay more for their food. So that link needs to be broken. But I think also actually getting businesses who are reliant on nature for services, which goes beyond just agriculture, understanding that the failure of our natural systems is a business risk. So we did a piece of work with Oxford University, the Bank of England, and UNEP, I think, this year, running a series of nature-based risk scenarios, including antimicrobial resistance, but also water failures, global food security failures, and found that the hit to the economy was actually larger than even what we saw with COVID and with the global financial crisis. And the reason we did that was try to elevate the story about nature and agriculture in the boardroom of the companies that rely on these companies and say, this isn't a sort of nice, fluffy agenda. This is a business agenda for you. You need to be thinking about how you work with your supply chains on more sustainable practices. So the only thing I would also sort of echo actually from Guy's comments is some of the initiatives we're seeing emerge now, particularly in the UK, which is a bit of a leader on policy innovation. So we heard about ELMS, the environmental land management system, so paying farmers to produce food, but actually to restore and make resilient their stewardship of the land, I think is positive. And risking the ire of Guy, I actually think some of the new revenue streams coming through on biodiversity credits, nutrient market credits and carbon sequestration do at least offer other revenue streams that can be considered as part of a package of actually also improving soil health and so on as well. So I think we've got to experiment and create these different revenue streams for farmers.
Very good, yeah. I mean, and also interestingly, I mean, I'm no fan of Jeremy Clarkson either, but it has been quite interesting watching Clarkson's farm, and Clarkson seems to become a bit of an advocate for climate change. I mean, farmers are very much at the bleeding edge of the impact of climate change, and there's perhaps a community there that can be more vociferously in support of action on climate change. So we've got a few minutes before we have to break for refreshments. So I'm just going to take a few questions that have come through on Slido. And if you've got questions that you want to ask in person, then please put a hand up. The first question, which has got 2 votes, is inevitably perhaps a question about Trump. Are there any unexpected positives on net zero carbon that could come from a second Trump administration? Anyone want to have a stab at that?
I can try and be slightly positive about it. Our reading on it is that although we probably are slightly more pessimistic around what Trump means for the IRA and stimulus packages, the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure bill, what I would say is that we actually think that the deregulation agenda, and this is some of the way that the markets are interpreting it and the investors are interpreting it, is that the deregulation agenda can actually provide this very catalytic effect for things to essentially be built, which means the grid, and it will mean still wind and solar in certain states. It's not that all of a sudden this just dries up to zero. And it will be other parts of the transition. It might be nuclear, it might be these sorts of things. So there is that upside, and investors now that we talk to are trying to understand what the net effect of that is. And some of them are actually coming out, you know what, the net may not be negative. Yeah. Yes, the stimulus packages probably will go. The unspent funds will likely be reallocated, but this deregulation agenda could have a very positive impact, and actually many are looking to Europe now saying, and how are you going to deregulate? Right. So I would point to that positive.
Okay, and maybe particularly on mid-sized businesses as well.
I'd also just actually add, we're hearing some really interesting stories. So the IRA has attracted huge amounts, the Inflation Reduction Act, it's a stimulus package, and it's attracted huge amounts of investment into green technologies, including things like carbon dioxide removals, sustainable aviation fuel, and electric vehicles. And we're now seeing, because it's profitable, actually some of the oil and gas lobbying to keep these incentive schemes in place because it's making them money. And similarly, you've got Elon Musk in the White House, but he is also making a lot of money from electric vehicles, so lobbying for some of those regimes to stay. So I'm not quite so sure that these green stimulus packages are going to go. I do worry about the state of the US as a democracy and the quality of life there, but for the green agenda, it may not necessarily be all bad news.
Yeah, okay, so Trump, not our friend perhaps is still, but not perhaps as bad as some people are saying. Ingrid, we have a specific question for you, and I know that Luke also has some views on heat pumps. But for you, the question is, any thoughts on how to increase the uptake of heat pumps in both residential and commercial properties, and maybe even industrial heat?
So the issue, what we're doing at the Green Finance Institute is working to ensure finance is not a blocker of the transition, and we've done a huge amount of work on the built environment. There's loads of green mortgages out there now. The issue is not supplied money, it's about demand from consumers. So why do consumers not want to do this? Because who do you actually ring up to get holistic advice about how you retrofit your home? Who do you ring to get them in to actually do that work? So my sense is this will take off when government does what it needs to do, which is drive demand through telling us this is a national mission, we need to deliver. We're yet to hear what Keir Starmer's plans are on the Warm Home Plan, but I feel a national mission that would then send a signal to the entrepreneurs out there to build the businesses that we need to deliver this is going to be when we win this.
Right, and then Octopus, of course, have done particularly well with their technology.
Amazing job, yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on heat pumps?
I'm becoming increasingly positive, at least with regards to the UK.
Luke has been very negative on heat pumps for a while.
I've certainly questioned the demand side, but the UK is definitely going to be, I think, a leader in demand. There have been quite a number of sort of announcements over the past few weeks that we think will bolster demand in the UK. Around things like even loosening noise regulations, providing more finance through the boiler scheme, which is the subsidy scheme, and so on. The only thing I would say to sort of investors in the room, which is that one good sort of leading indicator to get on that topic is, well, look at what the house builders are doing. That was one of the things that interested us, and so we were saying, look at how the house builders are going to comply with having to be zero carbon ready from next year, right? And it's fascinating. I went to Essex to see Taylor Wimpey's Homes of the Future, and they have 4 prototypes up there, and it's all good fun. And but only 2 of them actually have heat pumps. The rest are using other sort of solutions to try and be zero carbon ready. But so that was interesting. They're telling us that they can innovate in other ways as well.
Okay. I've got lots of questions here. Anyone want to ask a question in an analog way? No? Stick with digital. Okay. What is the impact of AI and data centers on power demand, power prices, and decarbonisation of the grid?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because obviously we can't invest, as you know, in our fund, we're impact investors. We don't have a theme for AI because we don't see it as sustainable impact. And of course, the opposite, it's driving much more power demand than is perhaps necessary. And often those data centers are being used to fund and power unsustainable practices and like just things that just aren't societally necessary. But one of the positive stories that we've had is that renewable energy is actually kind of a second order correlation to AI. And we've seen a number of instances where some of our solar companies, in particular First Solar, have been experiencing, you know, really positive sentiment from other investors, because it's seen as a net positive that if we're going to have more power demand, we're going to need more power, and solar is really the most sensible way to build incremental power capacity because it's cheap and it's quite straightforward to build. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely overall for decarbonisation, it's I would say a negative, because we frankly don't. I mean, we have different views on things like Bitcoin, but I don't think we need it. We don't need gaming. We don't need these things that a lot of data centers are powering. But you know, if it does incentivize, you know, a faster progression up that S-curve for solar adoption, then I think that could be a second order positive.
Okay. We're pretty much out of time. There is a question which perhaps, Ingrid, you could take later on, a very technical question about the green taxonomy, which I know that you're very expert on. Maybe as a final question, we haven't really talked too much about the COP, and maybe that's indicative itself, but maybe just a final comment from you all on the current state of play with the COPs. Do you think they're still delivering, or have they become less relevant in terms of the net zero carbon transition?
I mean, I stopped being interested in COPs in 2015, if I'm honest. We got the Paris Agreement, that was the framework. The action is going to be delivered at country level by businesses and governments working together. So this is now all about delivery. We might have most of the technologies that we need. There's a lot that we're seeing businesses and finance lean in on. We do need more encouragement from governments. So look at what's going on at a national level, I'd say.
Okay.
Yeah, I have to say I agree with Ingrid. I've been paying less and less attention to COPs over time. I think that, you know, the participants in COP that we really need to actually participate are countries like China and, you know, these big emitters who just regularly, I think, push back on a lot of the suggestions and who aren't really making the changes that we need. So in a way, you know, if they're not going to come to the table, then we need to focus on the parties that are participating and are driving decarbonisation. And yeah, as Ingrid said, just focus on a national level and also a business level to make sure that everything is economically viable and things are happening.
Yeah, I mean, not to repeat anything, so maybe just to change the narrative a little bit, I would just say that, you know, many are looking at the US with a deeply pessimistic lens, of course. Trump will take the US out of, you know, the process, that's a given. But it just means that, and we do think that other nations will take up that mantle of being leaders, not necessarily within that process, but certainly within the transition. We'd say, look at countries like China or India or even Japan. I mean, Japan 18 months ago launched a $1 trillion stimulus package called the GX plan over 10 years, so it's larger as a percentage of Japan's economy than the IRA was of the US economy, and no one's heard of it, you know. So we would say, look east.
Yep, and that's good. You know, that competitive dynamic between countries is very much evident now, I think, too. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope that was a helpful little canter around. We didn't quite make it around the whole pie chart, but most of the big areas. So thank you, and I think we've got refreshments now. So thank you very much.